Kristen Ashton here, and we're talking about Chapter 10, the auditory brain and perceiving auditory scenes. This is our first lecture, and we're talking about the auditory brain. So auditory pathways are pretty complex, as were visual pathways as well, but we don't know quite as much about the auditory pathways as we do the visual, partially due to their complexity, partially due to kind of the differences in how things were studied and the ease in which things were studied. So you'll notice that this is a lot more truncated compared to the discussions we had about the visual pathways. We'll spend a lot less time on it. Again, partially that's to do with the complexity of it, and partially it's to do with they know a lot less about it. So most of this information crosses over, just like we have in the visual pathways, where we'll see, that visual pathway from the different the left visual field versus the right visual field was split, and it would go to one side or the other. We're going to see that most of that is happening too with the auditory pathways. But we actually see that the auditory pathways still send information to the same side. So ipsilateral is same side. So we'll see that information from the left ear will go both to the left hemisphere and to the contralateral side, the right hemisphere. But primarily, we're going to see most of that information is going to that contralateral side, that opposite side. But we will still have some going to the ipsilateral side. So again, sounds from both the left and the right sides of the environment aren't really separate, and as they are in terms of visual information. So visual information, we take the left side and it goes to one side, and we take the right side and it goes to the other side. We don't necessarily have this because of that. We won't see that when there's damage to one hemisphere, we won't see that it's going to have a major effect on hearing. Because hearing's happening, it's sending information to both hemispheres. So when we have unilateral brain damage, it's not going to have those same massive effects that we saw in vision. So we're not going to have that. So let's talk about these pathways, and there is also a website link in Canvas where it lets you kind of play with these things a little bit more and see them a little bit more in a little bit more detail. So structures in the auditory pathway, they come in pairs, okay? So we've got two of everything. We've got one for the left side, and we've got one for the right side. So one for the left hemisphere, one for the right hemisphere, one for the left side of the brainstem, one for the right side, one for the left ear, one for the right ear. And where it starts is these type 1 auditory nerve fibers that are coming out of the cochlea are going to the ipsilateral cochlear nucleus. Now that sounds big and scary, but remember, ipsilateral just means it's the same side. So it's going to go to the cochlear nucleus that's in the same side of the brainstem as that ear, as that cochlea is, okay? So again, here's another way to show you that exact same thing. First, it goes into that ipsilateral cochlear nucleus, straight out of the cochlea into the auditory nerve. And again, it's going to stay on that ipsilateral side at the start. From here, the cochlear nucleus is where it starts to split, okay? And it will split into the main pathways, which will be contralateral. So this is where it's going to say, okay, most of that information is going to cross over to the contralateral side. So the primary pathway is going to cross that dotted line, and it's going to go to the opposite side from where it was heard. That being said, there are secondary pathways, which you can see in this image are the thinner lines. And so some information is still maintained on that ipsilateral, that same side. Now remember, this is really beneficial to us because if we do have brain damage, if there are injuries, we're going to see very little impact. This also has to do with some of the ways that we process sounds, the kinds of sounds in our environment. Speech is very, very complex. And speech is one of the main things that we have evolved to listen to. And because it's so complex, we can't really have it in just one side of the brain or the other. And so information has to go to both sides of the brain to be able to process this really complex information. So let's talk about some more of the areas that it goes to. The information, so we talked about it going into the cochlear nucleus, and then either splitting down to the primary pathways or the secondary pathways. We'll talk about each of these. One of the places it ends up is the medial geniculate body. And this is in the thalamus. And again, there's one on each side of the brain, so there's a pair of them. So if the information is coming from the right cochlea and the right cochlear nucleus, it will, on the primary pathway, go to the left hemisphere. It'll go contralateral, right? And this is the kind of one of the last stops on its pathway, the kind of the end of the pathway. And these are ascending pathways. So we talk about them going up. You see all these arrows are pointing up. So this is, your book discusses as ascending pathways because it's going kind of that bottom up kind of thing. The inferior colliculus is the structure, it's in the midbrain, and it's again a step on that ascending pathway. And it also goes, the information after it goes from the cochlear nucleus, one of the primary places it goes is to the superior olivary complex. And this is in the brainstem still too. And again, there's two of them. And what's really interesting is that they will receive information from both cochlear nuclei. So the left superior olivary complex will receive information from both the right and the left, both the ipsilateral and the contralateral cochlear nucleus. So they're getting information from both of those things. And this is, again, one of those steps on that ascending pathway. And this is the primary pathway that we're going to talk about. So again, your book does a really great job of lining that out. We've talked about it some here. And again, there's that website that's linked on Canvas that shows you that as well. Now, there are also descending signals, and this is kind of the opposite. This is kind of going to be from the brain back down. And your book talks about it vaguely. We're not going to really cover it, mostly because it's, again, not well understood. Also, one of the reasons that we're not going to really cover it much, other than that know that they exist, is that the kind of pieces that we do know about it are information that we didn't cover in this class, really, to kind of maintain a better level of understanding. So it's important to know that the descending signals do exist, how they work, where they go, what functions they're doing. None of that's important. Just to know that there is kind of a top-down feature going on as well that we're calling descending signals. So once it gets to the brain, the main place, just like we had a visual cortex, we have an auditory cortex. And our auditory cortex is tucked into that temporal lobe. Okay, so remember when I said you put your hands on your ears, you've got your hand on your temporal lobes. Again, we know that our temporal lobe is going to do hearing because it's right by our ears. This is very, very helpful for us. Here in the picture, that's going to be this pink area. When it says it's under the lateral sulcus, that's just that fancy way to say like a big kind of like fissure kind of thing. You can see this line, this kind of dotted line they have cut through, that would be the lateral sulcus. And when they kind of cut or give you a cross section across that lateral sulcus, that's where we're going to be able to start to see that this is really happening on both sides of the brain, that we've got an auditory cortex on the left and the right temporal lobe. And within that, just like we had a primary visual cortex, we have a primary auditory cortex. And that's the part of the auditory cortex and the auditory core region that I most want you to know about is the auditory cortex, the primary auditory cortex. The other pieces, not as interested in. So this primary auditory cortex, which we call A1, just like we had V1, A1, is part of the auditory core region in the auditory cortex. And this is those main structures that I want you to know. The pieces of that aren't important for your understanding of the material in this class. That's for subsequent classes if you're really interested in this stuff for higher level advanced versions. So the auditory cortex this primary auditory cortex that I said that I'm interested in you knowing about, A1, is organized tonotopically. So when we talked about renotopic mapping, and we're saying, okay, well, the way the retina maps onto the visual cortex, this is saying the exact same thing, that the auditory cortex is going to be tonotopically organized. There's a map in there about frequencies, okay? Now, how exactly it does this, I don't need you to know that it goes, you can see that there's differences in there and kind of the different patterns where we see low frequencies in certain places and high frequencies in certain places. All that's important to know is that it is organized tonotopically. That again, we'll see kind of these frequency gradients playing out, just like we see in the basilar membrane, these frequency gradients. We're seeing these frequency gradients playing out in the primary auditory cortex in the brain. So just as we had in the visual system, this renotopic map that played out in the brain, where the mapping on the retina corresponded to the mapping in the brain, we have the same thing going on with the auditory cortex, where the mapping from the basilar membrane is indicative of the mapping that we're getting in the auditory cortex. The auditory cortex neurons, just as the visual neurons were tuned to certain kinds of things, they had certain receptive fields, they preferred certain kinds of stimuli, just the same way that the auditory cortex does the same. The neurons do the exact same thing. And we can have neurons that are really narrowly tuned, and they only really like a small band of frequency. So this one, it would do best kind of, it looks like at about, somewhere less than 3,200 hertz. And it's pretty narrow. And so this, where its point is its characteristic frequency. That's where it's happiest. That's where it's firing the best. That's where it's really tuned into that frequency. But we also have broadly tuned neurons as well. And this can still have a characteristic frequency that it's going to fire for. But as you can see, it's much, much wider, that we're going to have, it still fires best for this one characteristic frequency, but it has a bigger band of frequencies surrounding it that it also produces this response for. For both of these, however, as the amplitude increases, which is what you see going up from 0 to 80 on the y-axis, as that amplitude increases, the bands become much broader. And this happened for the narrowly tuned neuron, just as it's happening for the broadly tuned neuron. Obviously, it's gotten a lot broader here than it did on the one before. But as this amplitude increases, the frequencies that it's responding to become broader. So the what and the where pathways, we have them in the auditory brain too. So all that hard work you did on the visual pathways is paying off. Just like this visual system, the auditory system has two pathways, and we can still call them what and where. The what pathway is important in determining the item that's emitting sound. So if I'm trying to figure out what is making that sound, I hear a banging sound or a clicking sound, that information is going to the what pathway. If I'm trying to figure out where this sound is coming from, where that item is the sound is coming from, that's going to be on that where pathway. And that's where where it's going to go. So again, just as we had in the visual system, how we have these auditory pathways split up into what and where, we have the same thing going on in the visual pathways. What's really interesting is a lot of this information is going to the same places. So you see here in this graph, the auditory what and where pathways are the red lines. In this image, and the dark purple, almost black lines are the visual pathways, okay? So those visual pathways that we talked about before, those are here. The auditory pathways are here as well. What's interesting is these really like kind of light blue tealish areas of the brain. Those are areas that process both auditory and visual information. So these are areas that are telling us where something is. These are areas that are telling us what something is, regardless of whether it's an auditory stimuli or a visual stimuli. What's most important is these things are being integrated in these areas. So we talk about these senses as they're completely separate. They're not. You're using both your auditory, the stream of information from your auditory cortex and the stream of information from your visual cortex. You incorporate that information together. And we can see this happening in the same regions of the brain that the auditory what pathways and the visual what pathways end up in the same place, or very similar places, very adjacent places that they can be connecting. The same thing with the where. We're ending up in the same place. They may have some specific areas themselves. You can see some areas that are purple that are just auditory processing. You can see some areas that are green that are just visual processing. But there's also a lot of areas that are this teal color that's processing both auditory and visual information. So again, it's really important to remember that we talk about these senses as if they're discrete and which there's not overlap. But there really is, and there's a lot of overlap. And we can see this even at the neural level, even at the structure, the module of the brain level. So this ends our discussion about the auditory brain. Thanks.